Okay, today we're going to talk about Chapter 7, Lesson 2, which is about Sparta and Athens and the rivalry they had. All right, so first we're going to talk about some political changes in general, which is happening in the region. Okay, and then we'll talk about each one specifically. So, first of all, um, wealthy nobles had seized power from the kings. We had talked about that, but they didn't end up actually ruling very long. What ends up happening is the farmers are becoming very resentful of the nobles. The farmers had borrowed money and from the wealthy, right, to be able to run the farms, and when they weren't able to pay them back, then the nobles would take their land and force them to work off their debt by working for the nobles. Or they'd have to leave and go try to work and find a job in the city, or even if they owed so much, sometimes they would have to sell themselves into slavery. And so you can understand the farmers are increasingly unhappy about the situation. And the merchants and the artisans are also getting unhappy. It isn't because they don't own land, right? So it wasn't that they owned money to the wealthy, but the problem was that they don't have much of a say in the government, because in many places in these city states, you had to own land to be considered a full citizen to have a say in the government. So there's a lot of unrest, and the wealthy are very concerned about this growing unrest, and as they should be. And this leads to a rise of what they call tyrants. Now, tyrants nowadays has a negative a connotation. Originally, these tyrants who rose to power, took control, they did so with the backing of the people, and most of them in the beginning ruled fairly. But there were some that ended up being really harsh. And so today, when we hear the word tyrant or tyranny, we think of someone who's ruling unjustly or cruelly, right? But try to remember that in the beginning, during these 600s BC, the common people actually supported these tyrants in overthrowing the nobles. Okay. And remember, also they were able to do this because the citizen soldiers, the hoplites, are the ones who are going to help support that overthrow. And they did things to make the people happy so that, they had their support. So the tyrants are going to rule for a while. There's another group, we're going to talk about the different kinds of politics, is oligarchy. Oligarchy, some city-states had an oligarchy, which is when the government is ruled by a small group of people, and we'll talk about that. And then, of course, some also are going to have democracy, which is all citizens share in the ruling of the government. Okay, and so we'll talk about who had which ones in a minute. All right, so let's first start with Sparta. So Sparta, first of all, on the map, if you look, is in the southern part of the Peloponnesus there. That's called the Peloponnesus Peninsula. And originally they were descended from the Dorians, who invaded from Greece in the Dark Age. And interestingly, this society did not choose to set up overseas colonies. Remember, we talked about how some city-states did that to help get more food for their people. Well, Sparta instead decided that they were going to invade neighboring city-states to get what they needed. And when they did, remember that it's common during this time that if you are captured during war, then you are then a slave. So the slaves that they captured and brought back to work for them in Sparta were called helots. Helots comes from a Greek word meaning captured, so it makes sense. And unfortunately, the slaves, of course, don't like being slaves, and there was a big slave revolt in 650 BC. Now, the Spartans do put down that slave revolt, but it does make them think that they need to kind of change some things in their society to make sure that doesn't happen again. So they build up this society based on a military idea, and that just stressed discipline. I have a whole Edpuzzle about it that I'm going to show you, but really quickly, starting when they're very young, boys are sent to military camp at age 7, and they are educated to, of course, read and write, but also use weapons, and they're treated very harshly. They thought that by treating them toughly, it would like toughen them up and they would be ready to survive, the pain of battle. They are continue their life in the army when they are at 20. You can get married in your 20s, but you can't go live, with your wife at home. You still are living in the camps, and even if you're married. And then when you're 30, you actually can go live with your wife at home, but you're still there training in the army. So your whole life is centered around that. And when you're 60, finally, is when you can stop being an active soldier. So your whole life is depending on these ideals. And women, because the men are gone a lot, right, either not living with you or off fighting, women have more kind of freedom than a lot of the other city-states. They can travel, they can own property. They also were considered, you're supposed to make sure that you as a woman are also in good shape, and they do sports and things because you need to raise strong men. And they also were indoctrinated to believe that their job is to raise the future soldiers. There was a interesting phrase that women would say was "come home carrying your shield" or being carried on it, right? Meaning your duty is to come home victorious, or if you come home, you better at least be dead then if you tried your best, right? Being carried on your shield. So that is what they thought was important, okay? And so they were successful in stopping any more revolts. Their government is an oligarchy because it has a group of people in charge. So they do have two kings, but they're ceremonial. They don't actually have much power. They do lead the army and they do all the religious ceremonies. But the real power for Sparta comes from the assembly and another group I'll tell you in a second. So first of all, the assembly is all the male citizens over 30. They can vote on should they go to war or make peace with the city-state. But the real power is here in this Council of Elders. Okay, the Council of Elders are the ones who have the real power. They can decide if you should be executed or exiled, right? They're the judges of what's okay. And then they pick these ephors. Ephors are 5 people for 1 year. And then those 5 people, I wrote elected, but they're like selected by the council every year. And those 5 ephors are the ones who are going to enforce the laws and make sure the taxes get collected. So these are the people who actually had the most power. So even though they called it a king, they didn't really have much power in Sparta. Okay, so Sparta is a strong military society. It does well. It has the best army, well-trained, very strong army. However, they do that at the expense of free thinking. You're not allowed to be free thinking and have new ideas. They actually discourage it. They thought learning would bring unrest to their society. So they did not welcome foreign visitors. They don't want outside ideas. They don't let their citizens go traveling outside the city-state unless there was a military reason to do it. They discourage studying literature and the arts. Again, they don't want to get those outside ideas. And this is an example of how, you trade and learning and expanding relations with other city-states is how people evolve, right? And so this is an example. They were stuck in their own ways and they were not open to learning new things. So when other Greeks were moving on to trading using coins, they did not. They kept their heavy iron bars. And so that shows like a resistance to change and new ideas. And because of that, their economy is not going to expand either, right? They remain a poor farming community since they refuse to, encourage trade like a lot of the other colonies are going to do. All right, Athens. Athens is located southeast of Sparta, if you look on the map there. They are pretty much the opposite of the Spartans. They believe that boys should be educated, but in a variety of different things. So, arithmetic, geometry, drawing, music, public speaking, and sports. They did think that their body and their mind should be strong, right? And so they stay in school till they're 18, and then when they're done at 18, they're expected to be an active part in, public affairs and the government. Girls, of course, you're educated at home with your mother on womanly arts, right? Like spinning and weaving and household duties. You are not going to be an active member in government, so you do not have to have as much education. If you're wealthy, you might be lucky because you don't have to know all those other duties as much, right? And so you might be lucky enough to learn to read and write and play music. But all women, your main job is to get married and care for the kids. And most women in Athens are not active in business or government. Okay. So Athens was very similar to other city-states around 600 BC. Their farmers are unhappy. They're calling for their end to the debts, and they're asking that the land be distributed to the poor, right? They're not liking that the power is in the hands of the wealthy, and only the few are doing well and everyone else is struggling. And so the nobles are very concerned about an uprising, and it's very close to that. So they start listening to this man, Solon. Solon is a merchant who gets the power, and he makes some changes to try to, appease the farmers. He ends their debts, and he frees those that were enslaved because of their debts. He opens up the assembly so that all male citizens can now be part of it and participate in the courts too. And so he is doing a lot to expand, right? The assembly is the one that passes the laws. The laws aren't written by them; they're written by the council, which is the 400 wealthiest people. So there's a lot of it's a sharing of power, but it's expanding their power. The wealthy don't like that he did all this, but of course the common people do. And so over time, the wealthy are not so happy with him. And even honestly, the common people actually end up losing some happiness with him, and eventually too, because they thought he actually should do even more. But he dies, and then eventually his relative Solon eventually takes over. And I want to talk about Pisistratus. So he would be considered a tyrant because he took over, and with the common people's backing. And he did even more to try to help than Solon did. He went even farther. He actually took some of the large estates from the wealthy, and he divided them up and gave them out to the farmers who had no land. So that, of course, would make him popular with the people and not so popular with the wealthy. He also extended loans to the farmers so they could be more successful in their farming and buy the equipment they needed. He also gave citizenship to them. You could, without having to own land, you could actually be a full citizen. And then he made sure that the poor had jobs by, public works, right? Like constructing temples and other things. And he gave them jobs. So, of course, he's going to be popular with the people. He also built many shrines to different gods. One of the main ones he encouraged an expansion of was Athena. Athena is the patron god or the main god of Athens, obviously based on the name. And he actually expands their festivals they had for Athena, added athletic competitions. So as a side note, right, you probably know that the Olympics started as contests that were in honor of Zeus in Olympia in 776 BC. So it's the same idea that, that contests in honor of a god or goddess is a common theme. And of course, we still have the Olympics today, although not for Zeus, right? But still every 4 years. Okay, so after Pisistratus, he died, a noble actually ends up taking over, and this is Cleisthenes. And Cleisthenes really praised the idea of democracy. And so he wanted to make it so the men still have this, the all male citizens could participate and vote in the assembly, so that was the same, but he makes the assembly actually bigger and like more expanded in their power. So not only can they vote on laws now, but they can hear legal cases and appoint army officials, so having a little bit more power. There's also a new council he makes of 500 citizens that he is going to have them have jobs to help run the government. And they have the power to introduce new laws, which is a new power for the people. Usually that's more for the wealthy. And they're going to control the treasury too. So it's definitely more democratic, getting more power for the people. They can also manage relations with other city-states. Interestingly, though, these jobs were not given, they're not elected positions. They actually thought that the council that these people are going to be part of, they thought that a lottery system was fairer, more democratic than if you had an election. And if you think about it, that kind of makes sense, right? To run for election, the people who were well known and looked up to and were wealthy people, okay? And so they felt like that they had an advantage in being well known and using their wealth to, make themselves seem good. And that brings up a good point. Like, who do we often see run now, right? People who have money and who can make themselves well known and well liked, right? So they thought that it was fair actually to have a lottery system to pick, and everyone could be evenly picked every year to see if they could get on the council. Now, when I say everyone, of course, remember, I don't mean foreign-born people or slaves or or women, right? These were talking about only men who were born in the polis, in the city-state. Okay, that's it.